All right. In the upcoming 20 minutes, I'm going to guide you through the design process of some of our voice application we developed for kids. So what worked, what didn't work, and what did we learn from it? From the ones who don't know what a voice application actually is, this is an application which is mainly controlled by your voice instead of using a more traditional input method like touch, click, or key presses. And if you're wondering, like, why am I focusing on kids? That's because kids actually have a very interesting way of communicating with voice applications. So these voice applications are relatively new, and most adults still find it a bit awkward to talk to. They don't know if they should talk to it like another human being or that they should talk to it like a robot. And it creates a lot of doubt. And kids, and besides that, if a voice app doesn't actually react like the adult expected, it's very likely that they'll get agitated by it. And kids, on the other end, they don't have these boundaries, so they don't feel ashamed and sometimes even see the voice app interface as another person, as a part of their family. And besides that, we notice that kids are way more forgiving than adults, so they don't get easily agitated by mistakes of the assistant itself. So this all makes it very fun to work with this particular group. I'm not sure. It's hard to see for me how many people are actually in the group right now. So I'm starting, since I only have like 20 minutes. So I'm going to start the presentation. Before I'm actually going to dive deeper into voice applications, I'm going to introduce myself. So who am I? My name is Luc Janissen. I'm a conversational designer for Greenhouse. I've been a conversational designer for 3 years now. And I'm responsible for the concept, design, and development of our conversational applications. So think about chatbots, but also about voice applications. And about these voice applications, I've been working with them for around 4 years now, and I really developed a passion for voice itself. I find it really interesting how people actually interact with their voice instead of using other input methods. And since the time I've been doing this, I've worked on numerous applications for the Google Assistant for big Dutch brands like Auping, ING, Donald Duck, and many more. And two of these I'm going to talk about in this talk. So the agenda for today, we're going to discuss two of our projects. One of them is Auping's bedtime story, and the second one is ING Rembrandt's masterclass. To give you a small introduction to those two, the first one is going to be an interactive bedtime story for kids we created a few years ago, and the second one is a painting class for elementary school kids by the groundmaster himself, Rembrandt van Rijn. But let's start with Auping. So what's the idea of this project? Auping is a mattress company, a Dutch mattress company. They're mainly focused on giving their customers a good night's rest. And they had this marketing campaign in which they wanted to light out the beautiful moments that people have in their bed. So this could be anything, but one of those beautiful moments was the moment that parents have with their kid when they bring their kid to bed, like the bedtime story moment. It's really a very important moment for both the kid and the parent. And we wanted to improve this moment, actually. So Auping itself has a very innovative character, so they wanted to do something innovative with it. And during the time that this campaign was launching, the Google Home launched recently in the Netherlands. So they said, like, hey, why don't we combine these two? So we didn't just want to create a audiobook, so to say. We really wanted to make it interactive. And we really wanted to have a story that's both fun for the kid and the parent. And all this had to work with the Google Assistant. So how did we get the work? So first of all, before we started to work on the product itself, we wanted to know how it would actually work to build an interactive story. So we created a prototype, and we made this prototype with an existing story because we didn't have a story writer at that moment. So we took Hansel and Gretel, a very famous story, and we picked the story, made it shorter, and put in some interaction into it. So before we actually tested the prototype, we wanted to have a few questions answered. The first of all was, what kind of interactions do we want to use and how many? The length of the story, so how long should we make the story to maintain the attention of the kids? On what age group are we going to focus? On the younger kids, the older kids? Does it work on both? And what kind of sounds are we going to use? To start with the interactions, what should you think about? One of the interactions was just simple questions like how many rocks should Hansel take with him to find his way back home, for example. Shouting, we knew that the Google Assistant itself wasn't able to capture that shouts. They are just able to capture sentences and can't say any volume level or something like that. The third one is gestures. We also knew that the Google Assistant was not able to see if a kid would make a gesture or not, but we still wanted to try out like, hey, does a kid mind that? Does it see that it doesn't register the gesture? So we want to experiment with that. So that's why we added gestures as well. And the last one was choices. So the kid could actually create his own story. So for example, should you go to the left side or to the right side? So these were some of the interactions that we developed for this particular prototype. So created a prototype with it, and some things worked, but there were also some things that didn't work. For example, the first one was Hansel and Gretel is quite a scary story, and we had a pretty broad audience. We had kids from 4 years old till 10 years old, and especially for the younger age, this story was a bit too scary. We kind of did this on purpose because we wanted to know how far we could go. But yeah, we should keep this in mind from this moment on. The second one was that it was too long. It was more than 12 minutes long. And even if we put interactions into it, it still was too long for some kids to bother. So especially at the end of the story, some kids even fell asleep, and some kids didn't even bother to pay attention any longer because they didn't like it or something like that. And some of the questions we asked were too complicated. So the challenge after that was to really balance all of those three things to make sure that the end product itself didn't contain these issues. There were also some things that did work. Kids really like jokes, very simple jokes. For example, one joke where the kid could go to the right side to go to the candy house of the witch, or they could go to the left side and they would go to the poop house, and you would hear fart noises and stuff like that. And kids really thought that was hilarious. You would think as an adult, like, okay, that's not really funny, but kids really love it. The same with the gestures. It actually worked. Kids didn't really mind that the gestures didn't get recognized. We still, it's like kind of the Dora effect. I don't know if any of you know the TV show Dora, the cartoon, where Dora is asking a question, and the kids just shout at TV like, I know the question, I know the answer to it. The same thing happened here. Like they're just waving their hands if they get asked to wave their hands or push the witch into the oven. They just did it all, and they didn't really mind that it didn't get officially recorded, so to say. And the third one was sound effects. We used sound effects to really immerse the kids into the story. And this was actually a pretty important part of the entire thing itself. So these three were very effective. And about this immersion, so after this prototype, we learned a lot. We actually made numerous prototypes. We had a lot of learnings over that, and we went on creating a original story itself. And it's all about Bram. And Bram, his bed flew out of the window with him on it, and his a robot toy, and he has to try to get his bed back to his bedroom. So that's where the entire story is about. And in order to get to the end of the story, you have to directions. So some of them were waving your hands to scare off birds. Another one was making a noise to make the bed fly again. And we took certain elements that we learned from the prototype and put it into this version. And we did some funny stuff as well. For example, the background music was very important in this one. We worked together with an audio studio on that. We the narrator of the story was a voice actor, so we really had a high quality voice. We first started to work with the Google Assistant voice itself, but it was at the beginning it was pretty robotic and didn't really work for us, and it really kept you out of the entire story. The immersion wasn't there at all. But what we did want to do was implement the name of the child into the story. So the child would really be part of the story itself. But in order to do so, we couldn't work with a voice actor for that part. So we had to use the Google Assistant voice for that. But that voice was pretty robotic. So what did we do? We took that voice, we actually made it even more robotic by adding pauses to the voice, and we created a character around it in the shape of a robot toy. So there was this robot toy that could suddenly talk to Bram, and he would help him get his bed back to the bedroom. And the robot would interact with the kid. So when you start the application, I will later show you a voice clip. It will be in Dutch, but you'll get the idea of it. The robot will actually ask the kid of his name and send the story forward. So I'll show a voice clip right now.
Meteen daarna klinkt er een donderslag en waait het raam met een flinke ruk open. De wind blaast als een storm naar binnen en tilt het bed met Bram op van de grond. Bram houdt zich stevig vast en vliegt met zijn bed door het raam naar buiten.
Ik heet Robot. Samen met Bram vlieg ik op zijn bed naar buiten toe. En hoe heet jij?
So in this voice clip, you heard that the first part is actually narrated by a voice actor. You hear sound effects, everything that a good audiobook has as well. And the last part was the robot asking the kid for his name. And actually the robot does all the interaction parts. So to recap this process, what did we learn from this interactive story? We should definitely not make it too long. Kids have a very short attention span, and if you do want to keep it make it a bit longer, make sure that you use interactions, because every time a kid has an interaction, they wake up again, so to say, and they find it very fun to do. But there is a mask to this. You should also use sound effects, but make sure you don't make them too scary, because kids are very imaginative. So if they hear a scary sound, they're easily scared of it. And the last but most important part is testing, because without testing, you're making assumptions, and the product is probably not going to work out as you thought. If you have any more questions about this project, feel free to contact me in the comment section. I'm happy to answer questions about it. Let's go to the second project, ING's Rembrandt's Masterclass. Let's start with an introduction video on the project itself, because it's originated from a project of ING.
You developed software for the FBI that can recreate a face from a voice recording, right?
Yes, that's right. We are working on recreating human faces from their voices.
Is it possible to do it the other way around, so to make a voice from a face?
Rembrandt van Rijn. Een van Hollands grootste meesters ooit. Een ongeëvenaarde kunstenaar die als geen ander de kunst van het licht en donker meester was. Maar niet iedereen weet dat meester ook leraar betekent. En dat Rembrandt zelf een groot deel van zijn leven heeft gewijd aan zijn pupillen. Rembrandt heeft beroemde kunstenaars zoals Ferdinand Bol, Govert Flink en Willem Drost onderwezen. Als trotse hoofdsponsor viert ING samen met het Rijksmuseum het Rembrandtjaar. Wat als we ter ere hiervan Rembrandt als leermeester weer terug kunnen brengen, zodat iedereen van hem kan leren schilderen?
So in this concept, ING, in combination with the Amsterdam Rijksmuseum, recreated the voice of Rembrandt van Rijn, and they did this by analyzing his face. So they looked at the paintings of his face, and by looking at the shape of his jaw, for example, they knew how he would sound like, and they created a synthetic voice out of it. They created multiple YouTube tutorials for this, focused on adults, so adults could get painting classes from the Grandmaster himself. But we thought, like, hey, why only focus on adults? We could also do this for kids as well. Especially in elementary school, kids learn to draw there and learn to paint, so this would be a perfect match. So we did that in combination with the Google Assistant. We created a Google Assistant app in which elementary school kids get educated by Rembrandt van Rijn himself. It's existed in 3 classes. So class 1 is all about sketching, the basics. Class 2 is all about creating light and shadow. And class 3 is about color. And these are all based on the YouTube tutorials. But we make them kid-friendly. And also for this, we created a prototype before we started to work on the real thing. And we wanted to answer some questions again. So how would it work in multiple class situations, since not every classroom is the same? How would kids handle the Google Assistant on the Google Home? How are we going to give the kids the right instructions, which aren't too difficult? And how are we going to work with the voice of Rembrandt, since the voice of Rembrandt was synthetic and he spoke Old Dutch. So he used a lot of words that we usually don't use in Dutch any longer. So we had some challenges there. So again, we tried to work with certain interaction. We had some learnings from our previous projects, for example, the Ouding project. So again, we knew we had interactions. Some of the interactions we used this time was at the very start of the application, where we did like a checkup if all the kids had all the right tools to go on with the class. After that, they received a explanation about the technique. This was done by, on one side, Rembrandt van Rijn, but since he spoke this Old Dutch language, he was hard to understand. So we combined that with the voice of the Google Assistant. This was a year after Ouding, so the Google Assistant has developed since then. And the voice was actually pretty good at this moment. So it was very clear we could use it to actually make a sidekick for Rembrandt, who could explain his difficult words to the classroom. And in order to test the kids afterwards, like, hey, you created some assignments on paper, you painted something, but do you also understand the theoretical part of the entire assignment? We did some pop quizzes after that. So a pop quiz question after they put some paint on their paperwork. And at the end, we also used background music during the assignments.
Super, dan gaan we beginnen.
Hoe de aanschouwers hun stuk bevinden, komt voort uit uw manieren van schilderen.
So that's where you hear the sidekick, the woman's voice. Her name was Inge. That was the Google Assistant voice in combination with Rembrandt van Rijn, who was a bit difficult to hear. To give you a small introduction in how the flow would kind of work. So it would start, and then we would do a tools checkup. The kids would get some explanations about the techniques, and then they would receive their first assignment, and they would have 4 minutes time to complete this assignment. While they were working on this assignment for 4 minutes, they would hear classical music on the background. Afterwards, when that was finished, they would go to the second assignment of this technique. And after that was done, they would go to a pop quiz where they would receive a question about the technique they were just learned. So this is just some kind of a reminder, like, hey, do we understand everything? And this will go on in a loop till they received all the techniques from that class. Of course, you have different situations, and we really worked hard with multiple elementary schools for these prototypes, and we tested multiple situations in that. So actually, the teacher of a classroom would prefer to do it to the entire group at one time. So this has some pros for the teachers since it's very time effective, but it also has some cons. Since there's a bigger chance that there's restlessness between the kids. They would talk between the assignments and stuff like that. And it's harder to understand the Google Home, especially for the kids in the back. If the Google Home is on the front of the classroom and there are kids sitting in the back, it's pretty hard to understand. So we also tested in smaller groups. The con of this is that it's way less time effective for the teacher. So instead of planning in an hour for this class, a teacher has to plan an entire week for this class to divide it into smaller groups of like 4 to 5 kids. But it also has some pros because there's way more focus on the Google Home. All the kids in this group can understand the Google Home and it's way less sensitive to errors. So they both had their pros and cons. So at the end of the final product, we offered them both to the teacher, and it was more up to the teacher which situation it would choose. But the final product worked in both ways. So we tested it with a lot of classrooms, and there were some things that didn't work that well. One of those was the retrieving of the attention. So after the kids were doing an assignment for 4 minutes long, the Google Assistant would just resume and tell the kids the next assignment. But since a lot of kids were very focused on their assignment, they didn't even hear the Google Assistant talk again. So most of them just ignored the Google Assistant and didn't even hear the second assignment. That also had something to do with the music volume. So during the assignment, you would hear some classical music, but for some, this was way too loud. And some of the assignments were a bit too complicated since it was all based on theories for adults. It was based on tutorials for adults. We had a hard time converting them into simple tutorials for kids. So there was some work to do after this. But there were also some things that did work. And to our surprise, that was the voice of Rembrandt. Since we had some trouble understanding his speech, kids didn't for some reason. They really understood him quite well. And I talked to some kids afterwards, and they really saw a grumpy old man while they heard him speak, and they didn't even saw a picture of him. The content itself was very, very good. The kids really created some beautiful artwork, and we even received some feedback from the teachers afterwards that the level of their skills improved by quite some amount. And the interaction itself worked pretty well as well. So there were classical interactions where like all the kids shouted at the same time, and the Google Assistant handled it pretty well. To come back to that attention retrieving thing, was a bit hard to fix, but actually the solution at the end turned out to be very simple. We worked with a countdown noise. So at the end of the 4 minutes, a countdown of 5 seconds would start, and all the kids were focused in one go. So sometimes it's very simple to retrieve the attention of the kids. Well, it could take a while before getting there. I see that my time is almost up, so let's go to the recap for this project. So it's brief and clear in your explanation. So make sure that the assistant itself isn't talking for all too long. Again, use interactions. It keeps the kids sharp, and make sure they are more alert and focused on the rest of the class. Also, sound effects work pretty well. So, for example, the attention noise that I just announced, like kids easily recognize these effects, and the next time they hear this sound, they immediately know what to do. And again, for this project as well, you have to test your project with a lot of different situations before releasing the product itself. And hereby, I want to end the presentation. So feel free to contact me if you have any questions. There's still a lot more to talk about, but I only have 20 minutes, unfortunately. But I'm happy to connect. Thank you.